That tattoo come out of a cereal box, old-timer? The voice cut through the low diner murmur sharp as broken glass, and every fork seemed to pause halfway to every mouth. Captain Logan Pierce leaned one palm on the laminate table, broad shoulders filling the narrow booth's edge, green eyes hard with the kind of confidence only youth and elite training could forge. Rain tapped the front windows of the roadside diner outside Fort Liberty, soft and steady against the neon glow, but inside the air had tightened. Glenn Mercer, 82 years old, did not look up at first. He stirred his black coffee once, slow and deliberate, the spoon making a small silver clink against the mug, then rested it beside the saucer as though nothing in the world had shifted. His left forearm lay exposed against the tabletop, weathered skin marked by a faded serpent curled into a five-pointed star, the ink blurred by decades, almost swallowed by age. To Pierce, it looked ridiculous. To Glenn, it was older than memory. The second operator, Staff Sergeant Owen Briggs, shifted uneasily beside his teammate, sensing the room lean toward something neither man fully understood. The waitress froze near the pie case, coffee pot in hand, while two truckers near the counter stopped whispering. Glenn lifted pale blue eyes at last, calm as winter sky. No challenge in them. No fear. Only a stillness so complete it unsettled Pierce more than defiance would have. That symbol means something, Pierce pressed, his voice lower now, edged with accusation. Or maybe you just like pretending. Glenn studied him for a long second, as if measuring not the insult but the burden behind it. Then he said quietly, "Do they still teach silence before judgment?" The words were soft, almost lost beneath the hum of the old refrigerator, but they landed with strange weight. Pierce gave a humorless laugh. Cute answer. He tapped the tattoo with one finger, casual, dismissive. Looks fake. Something flickered in Glenn's face then, so brief it might have been imagined. Not anger. Something older. The diner seemed suddenly too small. The smell of bacon grease and burnt coffee hung thick as memory. Briggs noticed. Glenn's hand drift, not in defense, but to the ceramic mug as though grounding himself against a tide no one else could feel. Pierce mistook the silence for surrender. "I've seen unit insignia from every theater since Desert Storm," he said. "That one doesn't exist." Glenn's gaze moved past him to Rain tracking down the glass. "That's because some things were never meant to." The line struck Briggs harder than it should have. Pierce smirked, but uncertainty cracked beneath it. He had come in expecting amusement, maybe easy humiliation. Instead the old man absorbed every jab like stone absorbs weather. Even the floor seemed quieter. Somewhere in the kitchen a grill hissed. Somewhere outside a truck downshifted on wet pavement. The bell above the diner door trembled from a gust, though no one entered. Sarah Whitmore, the waitress, watched Glenn's tattoo with a tightening in her chest she couldn't explain. She had served him black coffee every Tuesday for 6 years and never once asked about the ink. Now she felt, with sudden certainty, something sacred was being handled by the wrong hands. Pierce leaned closer, voice almost a whisper. "Tell me what it means." Glenn looked straight into him. "It means 5 men made it home." No one moved. Even Pierce did not answer. The rain tapped harder against the window. And though none of them knew it yet, somewhere beyond the diner parking lot, a chain of events had already begun moving toward that little roadside booth like distant thunder. Captain Logan Pierce held Glenn Mercer's gaze a moment longer, but the old man's answer seemed to unsettle him more than any argument could have. 5 men made it home. The words lingered over the booth like smoke after a match. Pierce straightened slowly, crossing his arms, trying to reclaim ground he suddenly felt slipping beneath him. "That sounds poetic," he said, though the edge in his voice had dulled. "Not an explanation." Glenn gave the faintest nod, as if agreeing with a truth larger than either of them. "Some explanations cost too much." Briggs shifted beside the booth, eyes moving from the faded tattoo to Glenn's face. He had seen men under pressure before, seen calm worn as armor, but this was different. The old veteran was not resisting humiliation. He was enduring it the way old oak endures winter. Pierce leaned back just enough to force a grin. You expect me to believe some secret brotherhood story because of a faded ink mark? Glenn reached for the coffee mug, lifted it with a hand that bore thin scars and age spots, and took a measured sip. I do not expect anything from you, Captain. Hearing his rank spoken without introduction made Pierce blink. Briggs noticed it too. How do you know his rank? He asked before he could stop himself. Glenn set the mug down with another soft clink. You carry yourselves loudly. It should have been almost humorous, but no one laughed. The truckers at the counter exchanged looks. Sarah Whitmore quietly set down the coffee pot and moved toward the back office, though even she did not yet know why her pulse had begun to climb. Pierce recovered first, pride hardening again. You think silence makes you mysterious. He bent slightly closer. Tell me what unit used that symbol. Glenn's pale eyes narrowed not in anger but in memory. A unit with no reunions. The answer landed heavier than the first. Briggs felt it in his chest. Pierce scoffed, but his certainty was beginning to fray. He tapped the table once with his knuckle. Convenient. No records. No witnesses. Glenn looked toward the rain-beaded window again. Records burn. Witnesses grow old. The bell over the diner door gave a faint tremor as wind pushed against the frame, and somewhere out in the parking lot tires hissed over wet asphalt. Sarah slipped into the cramped back office, shut the door softly, and lifted an old landline receiver with fingers that did not feel steady. She dialed a number she had not used in years, one belonging to a retired adjutant who still knew people on post. Out front, Pierce's voice lowered. You know what stolen valor is? Glenn answered without hesitation. Yes. Then you know why I do not tolerate men wearing ghosts they did not earn. For the first time Glenn leaned forward, barely an inch, but the shift altered the air. And you do not yet know what ghosts you are touching. Even Pierce had no quick reply. Briggs felt the back of his neck tighten. He had begun this morning expecting routine coffee before base duty. Now every instinct told him he stood inside something older than rank. Sarah's muffled voice drifted faint through the office wall, urgent and hushed. At the booth Pierce finally said, quieter than before, what was your call sign? Glenn did not answer at once. He studied the younger man almost sadly. Then he said, the men who knew it are mostly gone. A beat passed. Mostly. Briggs looked toward the diner entrance as if expecting something, though he did not know what. And beyond the rain, beyond the wet highway and the gray Carolina morning, a black government sedan had just turned off the main road. The question hung over the booth after Glenn Mercer spoke it, that single word mostly carrying more weight than explanation. Captain Logan Pierce opened his mouth to press further, but stopped when Glenn's gaze drifted downward to the faded serpent star ink as though the old man were seeing through skin into another century. Pierce followed the look and, almost against his own judgment, reached again toward the tattoo. This time his touch was slower, uncertain. His fingertip brushed the old ink, and the diner seemed to fall away. For Glenn Mercer the hiss of rain against the windows dissolved into the whisper of jungle wind moving through broad leaves. The hum of refrigeration became rotor thrum in humid darkness. For a breath he was not an old man in a roadside booth but a young operator crouched in mud, watching dim red signal light flicker over 5 silent figures, each marked with the same serpent circle burned fresh into skin as a vow none of them would ever speak aloud. A voice from memory, low and urgent, echoed through decades. If one gets home, all get home. The scent of coffee vanished beneath damp earth and cordite remembered only as ghost. Glenn blinked once and the diner returned, but something had shifted in his face, a gravity so deep even Pierce took a half step back without knowing he had moved. Briggs saw it and felt a chill creep up his arms. What just happened? He asked, almost to himself. Glenn flexed his weathered hand and rested it over the tattoo. Some doors do not like being touched. Pierce tried to scoff but the sound died halfway out. For the first time his confidence seemed borrowed. You are talking in riddles. Glenn turned his eyes to him. No, Captain. I am trying not to talk plainly. At the back office Sarah Whitmore gripped the phone harder as a gravelly retired voice answered. Frank Donnelly. Her words rushed low and tight. Frank, it is Sarah from the diner. There is an old veteran here. Glenn Mercer. 2 Special Forces boys are pressing him over some tattoo and something feels very wrong. Silence on the line. Then the old adjutant's breath caught. Did you say Glenn Mercer? Sarah's pulse jumped. Yes. Another silence, heavier. Do not let him leave, Frank said. And do not let those boys touch him again. In the dining room Pierce heard none of it. He stared at Glenn as if reassessing every assumption he had brought through the door. You keep implying people should know you. Glenn gave the smallest shake of his head. No. I am implying memory survives without permission. Briggs swallowed. His eyes moved once more to the faded symbol. What he had first taken for random old ink now looked deliberate, almost ceremonial. Pierce lowered his voice. You said 5 men made it home. Glenn answered, 4 walked. 1 was carried. The words dropped like iron. Briggs looked down. Even Pierce seemed unable to mock what he did not understand. Outside, tires rolled over gravel and stopped. Through the rain-blurred window a long black sedan settled beneath the diner sign, engine idling with quiet authority. Sarah stepped back out from the office pale with disbelief. She looked toward the window and froze. Pierce followed her stare. A uniformed driver was already moving around the car. The bell above the diner door gave a faint metallic tremble though no one had entered yet. Glenn Mercer lifted his coffee and took one calm sip as if he had been expecting the sound all along. No one in the diner moved when the sedan door opened. It was not fear that settled over the room but the strange stillness that comes when ordinary life senses something larger stepping near. Rain ticked against the windows. The engine idled outside with a low mechanical hum. Captain Logan Pierce stared through the glass, confusion hardening into disbelief as a tall figure emerged beneath a dark umbrella held by the driver. 4 silver stars glinted on wet shoulders. Briggs whispered before he meant to, that cannot be for us. Glenn Mercer said nothing. He simply traced one finger along the rim of his coffee mug, as calm as if waiting on breakfast. Sarah Whitmore's hand rose to her mouth. She knew enough military insignia to understand what 4 stars meant, and enough instinct to know this was no coincidence. The bell above the diner door rang once, bright and small, when the door opened inward. Cold damp air slipped across the tile floor. General Raymond Holloway stepped inside with the unhurried gravity of a man accustomed to command but not interested in displaying it. His silver hair was cut close, rain still darkening the shoulders of his dress overcoat. The room seemed to draw itself upright. Truckers rose from stools without thinking. Sarah stood frozen behind the pie case. Even Pierce, whose posture had held challenge all morning, found himself unconsciously straightening. The general's eyes did not scan the room. They went directly to Glenn Mercer. For a long second neither man spoke. Then something almost invisible softened in the general's face, a look too personal for rank. He crossed the diner floor, boot heels muted on worn tile, and stopped beside the booth. Pierce opened his mouth. Sir, we did not know. Holloway lifted one hand without looking at him, not harsh, simply final. Silence obeyed. The general looked down at Glenn and said quietly, You always did pick the worst coffee in North Carolina. Glenn's mouth twitched with the first hint of a smile anyone had seen. You were late 40 years ago too. Briggs felt the hair rise on his arms. Pierce looked from one man to the other as if language had abandoned him. Holloway removed one glove finger by finger, then rested his hand on the edge of the table. I got a call no one should have had to make. Glenn gave a faint shrug. Young men ask questions. Pierce swallowed. His voice came smaller now. Sir, you know him. The general turned then, finally letting his gaze settle on the captain. It was not anger in those eyes but disappointment sharp enough to cut pride cleaner than reprimand. Captain Pierce, he said, somehow already knowing the name, there are men whose service is not measured in records available to you. Pierce went pale. Before he could answer, Holloway slowly rolled back the cuff of his left sleeve. Sarah gasped softly. On the general's forearm, faded by age but unmistakable, lay the same serpent curled around a five-pointed star. Briggs took one involuntary step backward. Pierce stared as though the floor had shifted. Glenn Mercer watched none of them. He only looked at the old symbol, expression unreadable. Holloway's voice dropped almost to reverence. There were 5. Glenn answered, mostly. For the first time the general smiled. Then he said words that turned the diner to stone. Captain, you asked his call sign. He let the silence gather before finishing. You are standing in front of Viper Actual. And no one in the room seemed able to breathe. The words Viper Actual seemed to remain in the air long after General Raymond Holloway spoke them, as though the diner itself had become unwilling to disturb them. Captain Logan Pierce stood motionless, every easy certainty stripped away. The young officer who had entered the morning certain of what honor looked like now seemed unable to meet the old veteran's eyes. Staff Sergeant Owen Briggs felt something deeper than surprise settling over him, a sober recognition that he had stumbled into living history and almost failed to recognize it. General Holloway lowered his sleeve over the faded serpent star and rested one hand on the booth's edge. There were 5, he repeated quietly. But there was one who carried the others farther than any of us ever knew. Glenn Mercer gave a small dismissive motion, almost embarrassed by praise. Old stories grow taller in old men's mouths. Holloway shook his head. Not this one. Outside, rain softened to mist. The low clouds over Fort Liberty brightened a shade, morning edging toward noon. Inside, no fork touched a plate. No cup lifted. Even the grill in the kitchen seemed to hiss more softly. Pierce finally found his voice. Sir. I had no idea. Holloway turned to him, and there was no cruelty in his expression, only measured gravity. That is precisely why humility matters, Captain. Pierce swallowed hard. He looked toward Glenn Mercer, then slowly, almost instinctively, stepped back from the booth. His posture changed before anyone saw him choose it. Pride gave way to something older. Respect born in discomfort. Briggs moved first. He drew himself upright and stood at attention without command. It was not theatrical. It was reflex. Pierce saw it and, after one trembling breath, followed. The 2 Special Forces operators stood silent before the old man they had mocked over coffee minutes earlier. Glenn looked up at them with weary eyes. At ease, sons. This is a diner. A faint ripple of nervous laughter moved through the room, breaking tension without breaking reverence. Sarah Whitmore wiped at one eye with the back of her hand and tried pretending she had only been fixing her hair. Holloway eased into the booth across from Glenn without invitation needed, 2 old men facing each other over black coffee and years. You disappeared after 74, the general said. Glenn shrugged. War ended. Holloway gave a low, almost amused grunt. No. You just walked away from being remembered. Glenn looked toward the rain-streaked window. Memory was heavy enough without polishing it. Pierce remained standing, uncertain whether to speak. Finally he said, voice low, Sir, what was Viper Actual? Holloway's eyes moved to him. A call sign spoken only when things had gone very wrong. He let that settle. And when spoken, everyone listened. Briggs glanced at Glenn with open awe now. The old veteran merely stirred his coffee again, silver spoon tapping ceramic in that same calm rhythm as before the world shifted. Holloway reached into his coat and withdrew a worn leather photograph, edges soft with decades. He placed it on the table. 5 young men stared from faded color, jungle green uniforms, impossible youth, and on one forearm visible beneath rolled sleeves, the serpent star. Pierce leaned closer, stunned. Glenn did not touch the photograph. He only looked once and said quietly, "We promised never to explain ourselves." Holloway answered, "You kept that promise longer than anyone." Then the general turned back toward Pierce and Briggs. "Gentlemen," he said, "there are legends carved in marble, and there are those who choose to sit alone in roadside diners." His gaze sharpened. "Learn the difference." Neither operator answered. They only stood in silence as the old veteran lifted his mug, and for the first time that morning Captain Logan Pierce understood that the loudest lesson he would ever receive had arrived without a single raised voice. General Raymond Holloway let the old photograph rest between the coffee cups like a relic returned to daylight. Captain Logan Pierce could not stop looking at the younger faces frozen there, especially the lean man with pale eyes who looked unmistakably like Glenn Mercer before time had weathered him. "I thought legends were bigger than life," Pierce said quietly, almost to himself. Glenn answered before the general could. "Most of them are smaller. Easier to miss." The word settled into Pierce harder than rebuke. Outside, the rain had nearly stopped, leaving silver drops trembling on the diner windows. Sunlight strained through low Carolina clouds, casting a muted glow across chrome stools and checkered floor tiles. Sarah Whitmore brought fresh coffee without asking, her hands steadier now, though she set Glenn's mug down with unusual care, as though serving a guest she had somehow never truly known until today. Holloway looked at Pierce and Briggs, then gave a slight nod toward the empty space beside the booth. "Sit." The command was quiet but absolute. Both younger men slid into the opposite booth seat, no longer challengers but students at a table they had not expected to approach. Glenn regarded them with mild amusement. "Well," he said, "that is a change." Pierce managed the ghost of a humbled smile. For a moment no one spoke. The diner breathed again. Plates clinked softly. A trucker returned to his eggs. But the room still listened. Holloway folded his hands. "You asked what Viper Actual was." He looked not at Pierce now but at the rain-bright window, as if speaking partly to memory. "It was not a rank. It was a responsibility." Glenn gave a soft grunt. "A burden." Holloway inclined his head. "A burden, yes." Briggs leaned forward. "Sir, why has no one heard of him?" Glenn answered this time. "Because the best things some men do are not done for applause." Pierce stared at the old veteran as though seeing humility for the first time in living form. "And you never told anyone?" Glenn lifted one shoulder. "Who would I tell? The barber?" Even Holloway laughed, low and rough. Then his expression sobered. He reached into his coat again and withdrew a folded envelope sealed with an old military crest. He slid it across the table toward Glenn. "I came because I meant to deliver this in person someday. I did not expect a diner confrontation to choose the day." Glenn looked at the envelope but did not touch it. "You always did dramatize simple errands." Holloway smiled. "Open it." Glenn finally did, unfolding a thick cream letter with fingers worn but steady. His eyes moved over the page once. Then stopped. For the first time a real change crossed his face. Not shock. Something deeper. Almost pain softened by gratitude. Pierce and Briggs exchanged a glance. Holloway spoke for them. "Congress authorized restoration of a citation that was buried for decades. It bears your name." Glenn looked up slowly. "I told them no ceremonies." "There will be none," Holloway said. "Just the truth corrected." Glenn sat back, letter trembling almost imperceptibly in his hand. Sarah, pretending to refill sugar dispensers nearby, had tears gathering again. Pierce cleared his throat. "Sir, may I ask something?" Glenn nodded. When we mocked that tattoo, he stopped, ashamed. Glenn spared him the struggle. You were protecting honor the only way you knew. Pierce lowered his eyes. Glenn leaned slightly forward. Now you know another way. Briggs looked at the faded serpent star, then at the old photograph. 5 men, he whispered. Glenn looked at him and said, 5 boys. Old men came later. The bell over the diner door jingled as 2 young soldiers entered laughing, unaware they had stepped into a room where time had just bent. They stopped at once when they noticed the 4-star general seated beside an old man in a work jacket. And as every head turned again, Captain Logan Pierce rose from the booth, faced Glenn Mercer, and without a word came sharply to attention. Captain Logan Pierce's boots clicked against the diner tile as he came to attention, the sound crisp enough to pull every eye in the room. The 2 young soldiers by the door froze where they stood, laughter erased from their faces. Staff Sergeant Owen Briggs rose a heartbeat later and stood beside Pierce, shoulders squared, not from regulation but conviction. Glenn Mercer looked from one to the other and let out a faint breath that might have been amusement. Now you are making a public spectacle out of eggs and coffee, he murmured. But there was warmth in it. General Raymond Holloway remained seated, watching in silence, as if he understood some moments should not be interrupted by rank. Pierce spoke without dropping posture. Sir, permission to say something. Glenn gave a small nod. Pierce swallowed. The arrogance that had sharpened every word earlier was gone. I judged a man before I understood him. He paused, voice tightening. That will not happen again. Glenn studied him a long moment, pale eyes unreadable. Then he said, good. Because life rarely announces who deserves respect. Briggs added quietly, we were wrong. Glenn tilted his head. You were young. It was not the same thing, and they all knew it. The 2 soldiers at the door exchanged uncertain looks until one, barely 20, stepped forward and whispered to the other, who is he? Sarah Whitmore answered from behind the counter before anyone else could. Someone you stand straighter around. Even Holloway smiled at that. The general rose then, slow and deliberate, and the room instinctively seemed to lift with him. He turned toward Pierce. Captain, earlier you believed honor was defended through suspicion. Pierce nodded once. Yes, sir. Holloway gestured lightly toward Glenn. And what have you learned? Pierce answered without hesitation. That honor sometimes arrives looking ordinary. The general's eyes flashed approval. Remember it. Glenn folded the restored citation letter and slipped it back into its envelope. He looked almost uncomfortable holding official recognition, as though paper could never weigh as much as memory. Briggs glanced toward the old photograph still on the table. Sir, he asked Glenn, did you all really use those call signs in the field? Glenn leaned back. Only when trouble outran common sense. Pierce gave the smallest laugh. Sounds familiar. Glenn pointed at him with one weathered finger. Then perhaps there is hope. The tension that had ruled the diner all morning softened into something almost familial. One of the truckers removed his cap. Another muttered, well, I will be. Outside, sunlight broke through fully at last, laying bright strips across the wet parking lot. The storm had passed without anyone noticing when. Holloway glanced at his watch but made no move to leave. There is one more thing, he said. He reached into his coat pocket and drew out a small metal challenge coin, worn at the edges. On one side was the serpent star. On the other, a simple inscription. For those who returned others home. He said it before Pierce. Carry that until you understand it. Pierce accepted it as though receiving something sacred. Briggs looked almost startled. Sir, should he have that? Holloway answered, if he learns why. Glenn watched Pierce turn the coin in his hand, and for the first time there was unmistakable pride in the old veteran's face. Not pride in himself. In what the younger man might yet become. Then the young soldier near the door, unable to help himself, stepped forward and blurted, "Sir, is it true you are Viper Actual?" Glenn looked at the boy, then at Holloway, then at the fading coffee in his mug. "Once," he said. "Now I am just Glenn." But the room did not believe the second part. Pierce slowly lifted the challenge coin to chest height, then did something no one expected. He placed it on the table before Glenn and said, "Sir, I would rather earn it first." Holloway's brows rose slightly. Briggs stared. And Glenn Mercer, after a long silence, gave a slow approving nod that meant more than any. "Medal." Glenn Mercer looked at the challenge coin resting on the table and then back at Captain Logan Pierce, and something almost imperceptible changed in his expression. Approval, yes, but more than that, recognition. The kind one old warrior gives when he sees character beginning to form under pressure. General Raymond Holloway reached forward and slid the coin back toward Pierce. "Then earn it," he said simply. Pierce accepted it this time with both hands. Not as a trophy. As a burden. The two young soldiers near the door remained standing as though afraid sitting down might break whatever solemn thing had gathered in the diner. Even the truckers had gone quiet again. Sarah Whitmore set down a fresh slice of apple pie none of them had ordered, muttering to Glenn, "On the house. For making history before lunch." Glenn gave a dry smile. "Most expensive free pie I ever had." A ripple of relieved laughter moved through the room. But Holloway's face turned thoughtful. He reached once more into his overcoat and drew out something smaller than the envelope, wrapped in old cloth faded nearly white. He unfolded it carefully on the table. A worn metal insignia lay inside, crude and uneven, no official polish to it, only the rough dignity of something made by hand. Pierce leaned in. Briggs held his breath. Glenn stared at it as if seeing a ghost rise through steel. "I have not seen that since Cambodia," he said softly. Holloway nodded. "Found in my field trunk 2 months ago." His finger rested lightly on the old insignia. The unofficial 6th marker. Pierce looked puzzled. There were 5 men. Holloway's eyes shifted toward Glenn. "And one promise." Glenn closed his eyes for half a second, memory moving across his face. "We made that from helicopter scrap." Briggs whispered, almost reverently, "You kept it all these years?" Holloway answered, "No. It kept me." The room felt smaller again, compressed by history. Pierce stared at the rough insignia as though no polished decoration he had ever seen carried half its gravity. Glenn reached out and touched it with one weathered finger. That touch seemed to bridge 40 years. Then he surprised them all. He pushed the insignia toward Pierce. "Take a look." Pierce hesitated before lifting it, as though afraid to profane it. Scratched into the back were barely visible letters. V.A. Pierce frowned. "Your initials." Glenn shook his head. "Not mine." Holloway looked almost amused. "Read them fully." Pierce angled it toward the light from the window and slowly understood. "Viper Actual." Briggs exhaled under his breath. Glenn leaned back. "Call signs fade. Choices do not." Holloway folded his hands and looked toward the 2 young soldiers still hovering uncertainly by the door. "Come here, boys." They approached like recruits before inspection. One of them, Private Nolan Reed, could barely keep his eyes off Glenn Mercer. Holloway gestured toward the old veteran. "What do you see?" The private swallowed. "A war hero, sir." Glenn grimaced. "Wrong answer." The boy blinked. Glenn tapped the coffee mug. "A man who likes bad coffee and minds his business." The diner laughed softly. Then Glenn's tone turned gentler. "If you call every old man a legend, you learn nothing. If you assume every old man is ordinary, you miss too much." Pierce lowered the insignia with both hands and returned it to the cloth. "Sir," he said to Glenn, voice almost reluctant, "why did you never wear any of this?" "Medals, stories, Any of it? Glenn looked out at the sunlight drying the parking lot. Because respect demanded is cheap. He turned back toward Pierce. Respect discovered lasts. No one answered. They did not need to. Even the young private seemed to feel the weight of it. Holloway rose slowly and buttoned his coat. I have a briefing I am already late for. Glenn snorted. Still late. The general smiled. Then, before turning toward the door, he did something none in the room expected. He came to full attention before Glenn Mercer and rendered a crisp salute. The diner froze. And after one stunned heartbeat, Captain Pierce, Briggs, the two young soldiers, and even an old trucker in a feed store cap stood and followed. General Raymond Holloway's salute held in the air like something sacred, not dramatic, not ceremonial, simply true. For a breath no one moved. Then Glenn Mercer, slow with age but steady, with old instinct, lifted his hand and returned it. Not sharp like parade ground precision, but quiet and natural, as though completing a sentence begun decades earlier. The room seemed suspended in that exchange. Captain Logan Pierce felt something in him settle into place that had been restless for years. Beside him, Owen Briggs stood motionless, eyes fixed ahead. Even Sarah Whitmore behind the counter had gone still, one hand over her heart without realizing it. Holloway lowered his hand first. Some salutes last a lifetime, he said softly. Glenn gave a faint nod. Some friendships too. The general turned toward the door, then paused and looked back at Pierce. Captain. Pierce straightened. Sir. Holloway gestured toward Glenn. Walk him out when he is ready. It was not an order spoken for logistics. It was something older. A trust handed forward. Yes, sir. The general stepped out into clean Carolina sunlight, driver opening the sedan door as quietly as he had opened it before. The car rolled away down the wet highway and with it some invisible gravity lifted, though the room did not return to what it had been. It could not. The two young privates approached Glenn one after the other, awkward but sincere, each shaking his hand. Glenn accepted with the same calm courtesy he might have shown a mechanic or mailman. No performance. No myth. Just dignity. Sarah brought the check and placed it in front of him, then pushed it away before he could reach for his wallet. You do not pay after rearranging everyone's soul before noon, she said. Glenn chuckled. That sounds expensive. Pierce finally sat again, though not across from Glenn this time. Beside him. A small shift, but everyone noticed. Sir, he said after a long silence, I think I came in this morning trying to protect honor. Glenn looked at him. And now? Pierce turned the challenge coin in his fingers. Now I think honor might begin with listening. Glenn's weathered face softened. That will carry you farther than rank. Briggs asked quietly, will we see you here again next Tuesday? Glenn lifted his coffee mug, now gone cold. If the coffee stays terrible. Laughter moved through the diner. One last time. Hours seemed to have passed though it was barely afternoon. Outside, sunlight flashed off puddles in the parking lot. Glenn rose at last, slower than he once would have, and Pierce was beside him before he asked. Together they walked toward the door. At the threshold Glenn paused and looked back at the booth, the coffee cups, the old photograph, the place where history had slipped in unannounced. Funny, he murmured, all this over a tattoo. Pierce answered, no, sir. All this because we almost failed to see a man. Glenn looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once. Outside the air smelled of wet pine and warming pavement. Pierce walked him to an old pickup truck parked near the far edge of the lot, paint faded, tires muddy from country roads. Glenn opened the door, then turned. Without thinking Pierce came to attention again. Glenn smiled. At ease, Captain. But Pierce did not move. With respect, sir. I think I will stand a little longer. Glenn laughed under his breath and climbed in. The truck pulled onto the road and disappeared beyond a rise lined with pines. Pierce stood watching until it was gone. Years later he would still carry the Serpent Star coin, and younger soldiers would ask where he got it. He would only say, "From a man who taught me respect does not begin when medals shine, but when arrogance falls silent." And in a roadside diner outside Fort Liberty, Sarah would keep Glenn Mercer's booth empty every Tuesday morning, coffee ready, because some legends do not need monuments. They just need to be remembered.